Hi, I'm Sky.
And I'm Dom, and together we're part of the Escape the City community. Back in 2010, escaping your corporate career was a pretty fringe idea, but today, thanks to the advances in technologies and shifts in attitude, it's becoming increasingly mainstream. Escape is a movement of people who believe that life is too short to do work that doesn't matter to you, and that doing something different is possible.
We're on a mission to help 1 million people to quit their corporate jobs and find work that matters to them and the world. And we wanted to share the incredible stories of those who have already made their career escapes with you.
Welcome to The Escape Artists.
Hi both.
Hi Sarah.
Hi Sarah, thank you so much for being here. Our very first escape artist is Sarah Brown.
Well, I'm really excited to be on this podcast and thinking about the whole theme of escaping.
Starting out in PR and with a unique insight into the inner workings of Number 10, Sarah is a passionate advocate for global education and health.
My name is Sarah Brown and I'm the chair of a global children's charity called Their World. We've been going for 20 years. It's our 20th anniversary this year. And we have a real focus, a real commitment to looking at how we end the global education crisis that we see, where there's at least 260 million children who don't get a chance to go to school at all, and greater numbers threatened by the cost of the pandemic, excluding children from school. And we very specifically focus on how we can ensure children get the best start in life, how they have a chance to attend safe schools, and then also develop the right skills for the future.
Amazing. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about Their World and why you started it and how it's grown and evolved as I know it has over the past 20 years. So really looking forward to that. But I think to start with, what would be great is if we can start at the beginning of your life and kind of thinking about what you wanted to do when you were a child.
I was thinking about this before joining the podcast of, whether you're someone who wants to be a pilot or a teacher or, what those ambitions were. And I don't think I had a set career choice in mind. My mum was a teacher. She ran her own school in our own backyard. She ran a nursery school that my brothers attended while I went off to big school. And my father was a publisher. My stepfather's a public health doctor. Over that time, I always saw sort of professional achievements in the world around. And I think during the time, if I look through my teenage years, what I was interested in was campaigning and activism and the times of anti-apartheid, and joined the Rock Against Racism concerts and the anti-Nazi League marches, and a lot of kind of motivation to kind of create change, particularly around justice, as you saw it around the world. And then, of course, there was the Make Poverty History campaign that I could, everyone could get involved in, and I certainly did, and the Drop the Debt campaign. But none of that felt like it was something that could be your work. It never occurred to me through any of my childhood that that could be a job that I would do. So I don't think I'd settled at that time on what a career choice would be. I just studied at school and used quite a lot of my free time to march and protest.
And where do you think that drive, where did that come from? Because not all children or not all young people are particularly interested or really active in that.
I think some of it is the times that I lived through. I mean, I was at secondary school in London when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, and there was a huge pushback with her, against job losses, against the poll tax. And there was a climate then where marching and protesting was something that you could do and could join. And at that time, because my secondary school was in North London, it was a short bus ride away to where the action was, starting usually in Trafalgar Square. So it wasn't that it felt so far away. But I work now at Their World. We have a cohort of, over 1,000 global youth ambassadors who are in 90 countries around the world. And they all do what they do. They study, they work, they run their own organization, whatever it is they do, but they have a passion for change and bringing change to their community. And so it doesn't seem something that's such an odd choice to me.
I am also a kind of campaigner, so I can relate. And when I was younger, I was writing letters to the paper, writing letters to the editor about various things that were going on in the world. So I can relate. But I know that not all my peers were as interested. So it's always interesting to hear where that comes from.
Well, so when did that moment come when you realised, actually, you could do that as your job?
When I was 2, my family moved to Tanzania in East Africa. And I think that gave me what felt to me at that time was a vantage point of, oh, right, here's another place in the world and this is where I live and go to school and during our holidays, we all go off and see wild animals in a safari park because that's what you do. But I think coming back there later on, being in North London, going to secondary school, you realise you've experienced a really different world and that you've met people who have really different opportunities and very unfairly have things that they can't access in life that I'm able to take for granted. You know, I can walk down the road and I can go to school and I can study and I can think of university and dream about a choice in the career that I have. But I'd known people as a young child that certainly didn't have any of those choices. So I think that's embedded quite deeply in me. And then again, teenage years, you know, living through a teenage time in the late 70s and early 80s of rebellion and pushing back against what authority in the state had to offer felt like something that a lot of young people were doing, and really not sitting comfortably with things that felt unfair. But so I think that's where it comes from.
How did you kind of make the choice to study what you did at university? You studied psychology. So what kind of drew you into that? And what did you think you might want to do with that?
I'd gone through school. I went to a state school in North London. I was fortunate really that my parents gave a choice and I'd picked the local school to go to. But I was quite surprised that not everyone assumed that they would get their exams and go to university. That wasn't necessarily the norm across the board.
Yeah.
I did that. I got my exams. I went to Bristol University. I did a degree in psychology. I couldn't choose between arts and sciences. It seemed to offer a bit of both. And coming out of university, it was then career choices. And I remember there was a lot of push to join big companies and go to what they called a milk round, where all the companies had set up. I don't know why it was called that. I don't know, you maybe know.
I actually don't know.
But you walked around stalls set up from these different firms who tried to attract you to join their graduate program. And none of it felt very appealing. It felt very sort of buttoned up, and you were going to leave student life, put on a suit and never take it off, and go and sit in a cubicle and never leave it except at 5:05 p.m., you know, and none of that appealed really. I had a very first job in a market research firm. The best thing about it was the location. It was sort of 2 minutes walk from Carnaby Street and the heart of Soho. And nice. I moved from there to a company that I just was so delighted to join called Wolf Olins, who were a corporate identity design company. They were set up, they were entrepreneurial, they were quite visionary with what they were doing. And they were working with companies to get them to look at their values, look at their brand, look at the way they were communicating with all of their stakeholders, not just customers and shareholders, but employees. Even at the center of this company, they had a kind of wonderful canteen where everyone sat round a table collectively and ate together. And it's left a really strong impression on me the time I had there, just because they felt very different to that corporate world. And my job in the end didn't stretch me a lot in the end, but just that culture and environment I found very inspiring. And I think they were very ahead of their time.
So when you decided to leave there, you went out and actually set up your own firm.
Yeah, a project I've been working on came to an end and there wasn't really another obvious thing for me to do. So I decided to head off. But I think I also got a bit of an itch at that time where I wasn't quite confident enough, I don't think, to go and join somewhere that had a big setup and environment and a career pathway. I hadn't given myself that, by not joining a big firm, I'd never experienced it. And actually what I did is I collaborated with some friends of mine and we'd set up a studio, and one was a designer and I was doing a lot of the writing and the new business development, and another guy did the finance stuff, and we created a design studio. I would say it's fair to say that certainly my family and most of my friends thought that was a bit bonkers because it was risky, because there was no guarantee you would earn a consistent living. And actually we did pretty well. We had a studio in Charlotte Street, just north of Soho in London. We were employing quite a number of people after a period of time, and it was all moving at a very fast pace. And the other thing I liked about that was the freedom of being your own boss also meant that you could choose the things that you did additionally. So if we decided to do some extra work for a charity or for a cause we really supported, that no one was going to say no to that. That was our choice. This feels very normal now, but it wasn't at that time. It felt different. And after a period of time, we actually all decided that we all started to develop different interests, and it wasn't going to suit us to stay working together. And again, it was just time to move on and do something different. So I then worked with what was essentially a PR company, but we decided that what we wanted to do was to try and work with clients where you really backed what they did. So a lot of arts organizations, some charities, some media, rather than promoting soup and soap. But at that point, I became a lot more drawn to kind of political life and kind of had opportunities to do different things. So things start to change again. But it's that dynamic where I look back and think through my 20s into my early 30s, working with people your own age, who've got different ambitions, different skills, you can collaborate together. Yeah, it was a really good thing to do and a real privilege when I look back to have been able to do that. But there were scary sides to it. Like once you start employing people, you're responsible for their living, for how they make a living. And most of the time that's fine, but every now and then you're going to hit a wall where, your clients aren't as strong as they were, or someone changes their budget and all of that. You're in real grown-up territory at that point.
And how was that when you were dealing with that?
Well, that was hard. I remember one time with the design studio where we had to say to a couple of people, look, your work's going to come to an end. And I found that absolutely heartbreaking, at the same time as knowing there wasn't really another choice at that time. And of course, there's lots of ways to do that responsibly. You keep in touch with people, you're providing them the right references. You've never promised in the first place you're giving them a job for life. All those things make sense, but it's still pretty tough to do.
I can very much relate to that. Just the ongoing additional stress of when you're employing a group of people to feel like you're responsible for their livelihoods and not, it is hard. I was going to ask you a question about so when you created the agency and you were saying that your family and friends kind of thought you were a little bonkers. How did you deal with that?
Well, my family are always very supportive. I have brothers as well. And there was a moment where we used to sit and laugh with each other that I've got this, mother who's a head teacher and I had a stepfather in public health and they were working in Bangladesh doing these phenomenal projects. But we sat there and my youngest brother had joined the army. Another one was an economist. Another one was working on a journalist on a less than reputable newspaper. And I was in business. And we just thought they must sit there as parents and go, what did we do wrong? Like, how did we imbue these values? Except scrolling forward, actually, it's changed. The journalist is now a screenwriter. The economist was working on, good causes. The guy in the army is now living in Australia and living his best life. It's not, no one stayed doing that. And also, there's a huge amount of honor in all of those professions too, It was just very different to running a public health clinic in Dhaka, Bangladesh, to someone working on a tabloid newspaper or running a business. But again, it's things change and you people get different experiences. You don't necessarily end up doing the same thing in your life. And also the values that you have, actually you take with you wherever you are. And I think that's the thing I've learned is you can be doing a job that really is quite straight-laced and quite buttoned up, but you can still imbue it with all of your values.
I'm curious about something you said, that you didn't feel confident enough to go and work in a bigger agency or organization, and yet you went out and started something on your own, which is something that, I see and I hear a lot from people if they don't feel like they have the courage or the confidence to start something, so they get a job somewhere else.
Or you jump in and you're doing it and you haven't really got time to sit and reflect on it. But I think there is a different dynamic between if you go to an employer and they set out for you what they want you to do and they set the measures of success for you, for when you set up your own organization and you're determining those measures of success. So it's not necessarily a lack of confidence to be able to say, this is the product or service that we offer. This is the way we can do it for you to actually make sure you do deliver it on time, to budget, get it all sorted. But it's whether you're determining what that pathway is for yourself or whether you're fitting into someone else's. And of course, I've worked over the years fitting now into structures that are set by other people. And it's a different discipline, but it doesn't mean you can't bring something to it. But I think at that time in my 20s, I was less willing to understand how I would measure up to someone else's expectations.
Interesting.
So that's basically why you wanted to do your own thing, so you kind of like the freedom element.
I think so. Sometimes you're looking back and using the benefit of hindsight to try and figure out what that was. And I think what motivated me was some of the things I could do in my extra time. You would do your core client work and make sure that happened and worked. But the things that I was really passionate about most of the time were the things that I did in my spare time or added in, sometimes using the skills that we had in our own work environment, which I perhaps couldn't have done working with, I don't know, and maybe with another employer, they would have said, sure, if it's in your free time, come and do it.
Yeah.
But I was drawn to politics. I was quite active with the Labour Party. I wouldn't necessarily assume that with an employer, I could bring that into their space. You know, there's different
Right.
choices as you go along.
All of these various projects that you have spearheaded and been a part of, and organizations that you've started, they all make a lot of sense when you talk about kind of the, I guess what we call at Escape, your good idea criteria, which are the things that you need to exist in order for something to be the right thing for you, whether it's career or, you know, a business idea. It's got to meet some of those needs that you have. And it sounds like some of those things were, you know, having space to bring all of your parts of yourself into it. So being active in politics and being able to do that without it impacting your work, being able to set your own measures of success. Were there other things that you were kind of looking for in your career in life, which has kind of led you to some of those choices?
I don't know. I think if I look back at my school years, I was really frustrated by the sense that children that I was at school with, young people I was at school with, didn't have the same vision or ambition for themselves. There was an assumption that they would, you know, have quite narrow horizons for themselves. No one necessarily thought of going on to further education, or, you know, people didn't even think they would necessarily get a decent job. So a lot of people just assumed they'd make their income on the black economy, or they just go on to benefits, or some people even, the assumption was at some point they'd end up in prison, and that was just how it was, you know. And I couldn't bear that. I still can't bear that, that you lower people's expectations and they can't fulfill their potential. And you deprive them of that opportunity. And I think seeing that in Tanzania, where people just didn't have life chances at all, or seeing that in a school in my own London community where people had you kind of restricted horizons for what they could dream of and think of, is just something I think we can all do better at. And I think what I've learned through working, you know, independently with small businesses, with collaborating with colleagues, is that fantastic moment where you work together with people who've got different skills, but you share a common vision for something is an amazing thing. And whether that's to deliver the products and services you're offering through your business, or whether it's something you're doing as part of a campaign for change, it's the same spirit that comes for it, and you get something tangible as an outcome. And so it is work. It's hard work. Running your own business, you don't clock off. There's no, oh, it's 5 o'clock, I'm trotting off down for a drink with my friend. Like, that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But you're not watching the clock either. And I often say to people when they say, oh, you ran your own business and, you know, what would you advise? And I say to people, don't do it unless you can't stop yourself. Do it because you're so drawn to it. Because if you sit there thinking, oh, well, I'd like to switch off now, you don't necessarily have that opportunity. You know, it just keeps on driving.
Dom can relate.
I can relate.
Yeah.
I can
But
relate to that.
not everyone wants that, you know?
No.
It's definitely not for everyone. But people find themselves in that position sometimes and they think, actually, this is really not right for me. And they have those challenges, as you've said, around you have employees, you have, you know, that can be a real challenge for people if they get in and they don't really know what they're in for. It's actually not really right for them.
But there is also something amazing when you can get a moment where people are working in harmony towards a common goal, and everyone's got their different skills, their different support at, you know, all levels. Some people with the back office admin, some people, you know, all those pieces come together and the whole thing moves forward. And that's amazing, you know. Well, and also you can't always see the change straight away. Sometimes you have to go, well, where was I 12 months ago or 2 years ago? And then sometimes you can notice actually that you've done an awful lot more than you feel like you're doing.
It's a good reminder. When you're in the weeds, it can be very difficult to see how far you've come, for sure. So you started Their World almost 20 years ago. Why did you start that, and what were you trying to achieve at that time?
When we started the charity, I mean, I co-founded it with others, so I wasn't the only driver for it, but it was seeing a few things that would add different experiences and just reached a moment where you say, actually, if we set this up, let's have a look at, mostly for children and young people, some of the focus on women, but using ideas that are coming from the community and from grassroots level to inform and influence and create change. So when we set up a health project, we were looking at what community health workers and midwives would bring, not just the doctors and the research scientists. And the same with education programs is ideas that people would bring forward. So it started with quite small horizons of funding local community projects and a particular focus on a kind of health research project that was for premature babies and little ones, just to see whether there was outcomes that could create better start in life. And some of those projects really grew to fruition, and the small health project we started is now a groundbreaking world-class laboratory based in Edinburgh that just does the most extraordinary work just with the most vulnerable babies and children, and what the support is that you can bring to it, both from science and the laboratory, but also from the kind of practical hands-on care and matching up the two. But as it grew, alongside that, I was also going through a really different time in my life where my husband was a politician. He'd become Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was looking after all of the nation's finances. And then suddenly it catapulted up to living at number 10 Downing Street when he became Prime Minister. So it was it's not that it all happened overnight, but you've got this small charity that was really important to me ticking along. But my life was changing in a very different way alongside it. So the charity, it stayed quite small for a long time, doing really valuable projects that were meaningful with a lot of good support for it. But in the last 10 years, we've shone the light on the education crisis and really looked at what we could do there. And so it's absolutely grown to another level. So we find ourselves 20 years on with a global children's charity that's doing this extraordinary work. And so I found myself committing the vast majority of my working time to it. And something that to me that was part-time activism has now become my full-time main work.
It's amazing to hear how it's changed over the last 20 years and kind of in parallel with this other journey you've been on, which is obviously quite disruptive in your life also. And very, I can only imagine.
Well, when I started doing some things with the Labour Party, I didn't realise that through that I would meet my husband, Gordon. And then, of course, as his political career just continued to grow and grow, that was his work and his life. But obviously I was very much in the mix for it.
So you set up the charity, obviously, before the journey went to number 10. Did your vision for the charity have to take a back seat because of your husband's political career?
It's a really good question. And the answer is yes, to some extent it did, because what I couldn't do was use any of the advantages of where we were or who he was to be able to kind of boost what the charity was doing or anything like that. I had a young family by that point too, and there was quite a set of responsibilities that came with living at Downing Street to kind of be involved in some of that political life too. So the charity continued and did its work, but I made sure it was in an office completely separately. It had its own separate staff, and we would follow I followed the same rules. The same rules that existed was charities could apply to Downing Street to have a reception. And you could write in and you would do your best to accommodate everybody. But we would never give any charity more than one thing in a year. So I applied the same rule to my charity. It could come in and do one thing a year, and after that, off you go. Yeah. So we did that so that it was a good way to say, all right, all the people who are supporting it can come in once, just like another charity can. So you just kept it as level as possible for it. But it's always complicated because you think about where donor support comes from and things like that. And it was just... you just had to keep all of that very, very separate and arm's length. So we did all kinds of different fun things to fundraise for it and make sure it worked. So it would be foundations supporting it. We used to do a football match at Chelsea Football Club at Stamford Bridge where people would come and play, and it was a really good fundraising. So there's lots of kind of great things like that we could do that would completely separate and far away, and that would continue to help fund the projects that we were working on.
So if you had to put the brakes on the vision a little bit because of your husband, did it then catch up when he stopped becoming Prime Minister, and did he then lend more help to accelerate the vision in the last 10 years?
I haven't had to lean on him too much, really, to do very much. He's got a role where he's a United Nations envoy, and he's a World Health Organization ambassador these days, where he's out there fighting to try and get vaccine equality so that countries around the world where children are not vaccinated, we can try and kind of change that, in part so that they have that same opportunity that we do, but also because none of us are safe until everyone's safe. This is why we get new variants coming around. So that's his mission, which he's very focused on. And he's been involved in other campaigns that don't overlap with me, where he's, caring about the future of Scotland, or he's, focused on issues around the global economy. So he's there and doing his thing, and I can focus and do what I do. But it's difficult. You live in the shadow of somebody who is a really big figure that everybody knows, and you get on what you do. And there is a lot of assumption that what I do somehow is either in service of the great man, or it's somehow my skill or my opportunities come because of doors he can open, or whereas I would say a lot of it is the other way around, where I think he's really lucky to have me, having given so much time to the things that he's done, where I did think that the great opportunity, but also the great privilege at 10 Downing Street was to go, this is a public building with no public access. All these decisions are being made in this building for people around the country and around the world, and yet people would love to come and see it and be part of it, but they, for the most part, can't be. It's a working building and there's an awful lot of security out the front. So what I could do was host receptions, have people come in, but you have to put your time to that, and therefore it's not going to something else. So that I did do a lot of that, and I thought that was the best thing that I could do with that time for being there. We weren't there forever. We haven't been there for more than 10 years, 11 years, and life continues, really. But I am absolutely clear that it's, my skills, my experience, my connections, my work, and the people that I work with that builds their world. I'll tell you one way we do benefit from is when he left office, he decided that he's got his pension from being a member of parliament for years, and he's not going to make extra money. That was his decision. And so every time he does have money that comes in, it gets supported through an office for public service, and everything left, thank you very much, goes to their work.
Right.
So we do benefit from him in that way.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, I think it seems like, it feels like a fair trade to me.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting challenge as a woman, specifically. You don't hear very often men being criticized the same way of, oh, it's your wife who's giving you all these opportunities. That must be really challenging. How have you dealt with that? Who supports you in those sort of moments?
One of my favorite things that was said to me was when somebody came up to me and said, and I realized I was juggling a baby and a toddler. I was hosting a reception. I was, come back from a trustees meeting with the charity. And they said breezily to me, so what's it like to have given up work? And though I don't think anyone says that to a man, I think that's specifically directed at that sort of comment to a woman. And I can't remember how I answered, but I'm sure it's politely and through gritted teeth. But
it's very restrained of you.
But it has stayed with me, yeah. How you get through that, I don't think I'm a big ta-da, put myself to the front kind of person anyway. I've always enjoyed working collaboratively, and I always think that my strength comes from working with other people who bring so much more, and you get something bigger out of that. So therefore, I don't think that's been the greatest issue. And that you asked where the support comes from. Well, my first line of support is always Gordon, who's always ready to see what I do, and family and friends. So I don't feel unseen in that way. But I'd worked very successfully with companies doing, I'm sure it resonates both of you, that thing where you do presentations to people, you're speaking all the time, you're explaining what you do, you're going through a PowerPoint presentation. So all the time there's presenting. But when it came to those moments of a shift of public speaking. People would assume if you're doing something in a centre of government in Downing Street that, oh, you'll just pop up and make a speech about something. That I didn't have any experience of. And I really struggled with that I was very good at laying on a reception, arranging something, having the person who ran the charity go and give the speech, like doing all those things without it being me that had to stand in front of the lectern. And that did shift, where I suddenly realized that I was losing the chance to use my voice for things that I cared about if I didn't get up there and speak. And the first few times I did it, I was abysmal. I mean, just mumbling into a piece of paper. You know, the very first big speech I gave, I got to the end of it and I hadn't been breathing properly. I just raced to the end of it. So I passed out. I fainted.
No.
Oh, gosh.
And appalling. And it was also one of those moments where I'd invited people I knew and, come and it was terrible, but never been quite as bad again. And I meet so many people who are fearful of public speaking, who don't like doing it, who avoid it. But if you don't do it, then people can't hear your story or your message or what you have to say. And if you're campaigning or you're wanting change, you can't create change if you can't be heard. And I would definitely have, if I could go back and do it again, I would use the chance to practice with fewer people watching. Like do it when no one's listening. Do it when no one knows who you are and they don't care. So that thing where people say, well, there's no point me doing it because no one's interested in what I say. That is the perfect time to start doing it, because no one need to remember you or worry about it. Do not do it the way I did it, where I have stood out in front of rooms of people where everyone's looking at you very expectantly. And I've mumbled into a piece of paper with, holding it in front of my face, it's, now I can do it. Now I don't care, but yeah.
So now you're totally over it and you have no fear of it at all.
But I've had some of the worst moments where I was leading a very big campaign, maternal mortality campaign, which was to protect and save the lives of women in pregnancy and childbirth. It was a big platform I had in government. I had big opportunities. I went to the World Health Assembly in Geneva to address all of the world's health ministers. I knew I was nervous, but I had a speech written down and they said, you have to give the speech that's written because lots of people have it in translation. So you can't go off script. And the Secretary General of the United Nations spoke before me. He got up, he went to the lectern. He was word perfect, he was marvellous. He got down. He unfortunately took my written speech with him when he got off the lectern and I was next. So there was no written copy for me and my auto cue broke down. That was one of the longest moments of my life, where you go, I don't have the confidence for this. I don't know how to brush this off. And so I ended up standing there going, I would continue, but I'm under very strict instructions not to, while desperately looking for somebody to give me a paper copy of my speech, which they did probably only 30 seconds later. But time stood still for that moment. Because it was so important and it mattered so much and I wasn't confident enough for it, So that was a bad one. So anyway, once you've done things, what's the worst thing that can happen is you faint or you lose your words to your speech. Once that's happened and you're still standing and no one's gone, we're never talking to you again, you keep going. You learn. Yeah. It's just the hard way.
Exposure therapy, isn't it? What they say, exposure therapy.
Yeah.
You talking about this now is really inspiring. I mean, I used to be very afraid of public speaking, and I definitely never had to speak in front of all of the world's health ministers, that's for sure. You've had such a unique experience of obviously your own career and all of the things that you're doing, and also obviously living in Number 10. And as you say, as somebody who has historically been somebody who is behind the scenes and makes things happen, being thrust from that to kind of this public persona and in front of people, and all of a sudden everybody knows who you are. What was that like for you personally, and how is that for you today?
I can't imagine what that's like for somebody who's suddenly become famous now, where you go from not well known to suddenly being thrown in the limelight. I think with all of social media, with everything, I think it'd be very overwhelming. But I'd had 10 years where Gordon had been at number 11 Downing Street. So I was not really famous and no one really noticed me, but I'd been able to experience the environment. I did think that the shift through to him being Prime Minister and us being at number 10 would just be a slight gear change. And it wasn't. It was a much bigger shift where you suddenly realize people really know who you are. But at the same time, it's that you feel constantly on show, but I was still able to go round sometimes and lead quite a normal life. So if I left the gates of number 10 and went and jumped on the tube and just was on the underground, no one would really see you there. If you're just going around your normal business, no one really notices you. It's you sort of but as soon as you're out in a way where people are going to recognize that you're there, then you get seen. So I think I was fortunate that I did have moments where I wasn't always completely on show. I used Twitter a lot at the beginning because I felt there was quite a responsibility to kind of open things up a little bit and just show the sort of, if you're a public figure, then the public does have a right to some public access. They can leave your kids to one side, but you need to show who you are and what you do if what you're doing impacts on their lives. So it's trying to get that balance right. So I used Twitter just to be able to put out what I was doing and where I was going so that people would see that. And then I could nip off and do a bit of shopping for food and no one would really see you there at all. So it was just that sort of, or it would always be, I don't know, you'd be in Marks and Spencer's, you'd have just thought, I'll just go get some socks and underwear. And that's the moment someone would come or you'd have just shoved some massive cake in your shopping basket where someone would come, That's the moment they come over and look at you. It's never when you've got the salad.
Well, I'm not sure if you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but was it a relief then when it finished and you take a step back from number 10?
There was no relief in the sense that we didn't want to lose the election that we did and we didn't want to move off. And there was no relief in thinking that things that you wanted to be doing couldn't happen because you're obviously making that choice to continue. But in terms of just being able to lead your normal life, it's certainly an easier day-to-day to not have all of that commitment lined up for you all of the time and expectation all of the time.
Oh, yeah.
And also the moment where your next mistake is about 3 minutes ahead of you all the time. So that side of it, you don't miss it really. And the only thing I found that we missed when we left was you work so closely and so intensely with people that you get to know really well, whether it's policy people or someone who's, just going and getting you a cup of tea and a sandwich, all of that, you miss those people because they're suddenly gone overnight.
Yeah.
But the rest of it, you can still pick out what you can do in terms of public service and continue that. So it's not like you suddenly have nothing to do.
Yeah.
So looking back at your experience of seeing the kids around you in North London, lacking ambition and opportunity, do you think that things have changed since then?
I think for children around the UK, what's been tough for them is all of them have had their schooling disrupted. All of them had their education disrupted. Nobody's been unaffected by the pandemic. And so there's a lot of conversation around what the learning gaps are for children going back and what support they're going to need. So I think that's a very real issue. The other thing is looking at the levels of child poverty around the UK, but even broadly around Europe, other parts of the world, is what we do about that. If you've got kids coming to school who haven't had a decent breakfast, aren't going to get a decent lunch, who need that sort of support. So I think as a UK community and as a global community, we have to look at what's going on near us and look at what that impact is on families. I think everyone feels very stressed and stretched by this pandemic and what the impact is, the impact of long periods of isolation, the impact on earnings and income for families, the rising cost of living. So all of that is really, really tough. And, as I'm talking, I'm trying to avoid being political about it, but it's still right there and very evident to people that child poverty is absolutely unacceptable, and it's really unacceptable in a country that overall can afford to look after everybody and to provide everything that a child needs to go to school so that they can go to school safely and comfortably and well fed and learn. And each of us can play a part in that. We certainly have a part we can play in how we choose to vote, how we choose to serve in our local communities. But also you can think of something you can do. You can just be aware of the families that you see within your immediate environs. And what we're doing at Their World is focused on that global, bigger picture, where you're calling on governments at that global level to step up and kick in the financial support, but also the political will to say, hang on a minute, it doesn't cost a lot to educate a child. We've worked a long time with Syrian refugee children who are in Lebanon or in Turkey and the Greek islands. The cost of their education is a few $100s a year. Yeah. It's not this overwhelming figure that we can't service and provide. And you need to combine that with the education you can provide, with any sort of trauma support and emotional support, and making sure they get a decent meal and are safe. And that I think we can do as a kind of basic thing to honor humanity everywhere. And I think we've learned through this pandemic how interconnected we are. If we're not all vaccinated everywhere, then we're not safe where we are. If we are not making sure that children are educated on other parts of the world, by 2030, half of young people are on track to not have the skills to employ themselves or to get a job because we've just left out too many people along the way. Well, what do you think they're going to do? You think they're going to sit around and go, oh, well, it's a bit of a shame? They're angry. They're going to move. They're forced to move. They can't, sustain themselves where they are. And then we're all faced with a world that feels very unstable. So there is a global responsibility, I think we have, to service other people, protect our planet, but also know that by doing that, we look after each other closer to home too. So I think all of the things that I've done through my life, where I've been to school, where the kids are, I know, where the work that I've done just doesn't take me further away from seeing that bigger picture. And I've had the huge privilege of being able to do things in the United Nations, do things in the World Health Organization, sit in 10 Downing Street, but I don't lead that life day to day. I live in a small village in Scotland. I work with amazing colleagues with a charity where we're all very focused on the same thing. And we connect in with this network of global youth ambassadors who are aged between 18 and 30, who want to make their part to change things. And we collaborate and work together to give them the tools and skills for their campaigning and activism, as well as the push that we can provide ourselves.
If I'm sat here in a corporate job, or in any job really, and I feel like I've lost my path, but I have some skills and I want to make a difference, and it's eating away at me in January 2022 that I'm kind of not using my skills for good. What advice would you give that person or those people?
Well, the first thing is I think it's perfectly healthy at the beginning of January to kind of get itchy and kind of reset and rethink, pandemic or no pandemic. It doesn't mean you should walk away from your job as the first action. Sometimes you can sit there and shape what you're doing from where you are, particularly as so many people are working from home at the moment. There's a lot of opportunity you can do. I mean, people are able to do their work and compartmentalize that away from things that they want to do with their own activism and their own campaigning. Or there's the route where you actually take the skills you've got and look at them and think, can I apply that and take that somewhere else? Or would I like to be somewhere? And that, of course, is your job, Dom, to sit and work with people and say, well, is there a place where you can be that would actually utilize your skill set and your enthusiasms and your passions and take you closer to where you want to be? But I think step one is not necessarily to hand in your notice. It's to say, what are the things I do that can kind of provide that nourishment and fulfillment that I want, both professionally and personally? And there's always something you can do where you think, I can do something for somebody else. I can make sure there's somebody else who's plugged in, connected, looked after, whether it's making sure you check in and talk to somebody else, or you get involved with a charity or organization that's doing something that you're passionate about. And the community that we have at Their World, we've got people who will sign up to, we have a weekly newsletter that goes out that just shares stories about what's happening around the world. That's free, but it gives people small actions that they can take. You can sign a petition, you can write to somebody, you can call on an action, you can sponsor someone you see doing something amazing, you can, all those sort of small actions. So sometimes I think sitting there in January, it's a bit like starting the diet and the exercise regime. It's like, maybe it's okay to just have a meat-free Monday. You don't have to go full vegan for the year and then fail by week 2. It's like, take the changes that you can make and do what we were talking about earlier, which is sometimes you kind of just look back 12 months and go, where how's that shifted? Because you can't always see the speed of change. If you're just trying to decide it's all got to happen today and someone else on social media has a better life than you, and see if by the time you get to this time next year, you can go, I did quite a lot this year.
Amazing. No, thank you. And actually, that kind of leads along to my other final question. Sky, you may have some more, but it's more of it. Are there any asks that you would like from our community that could help you or in your world, in your work?
Well, if anyone's got an interest in what we're talking about doing at their world, or they're feeling moved in the same way, certainly getting our newsletter, where you just go to theirworld.org and sign in to get it, and it lands in your inbox and you can switch it off when you don't want it anymore, is a very good way. Or following us on social media. Or people can follow me directly at Sarah Brown UK on Twitter, and they'll pick up quickly things that are going on. So I think just being connecting in and having a look at what we're doing. And because we also share other things that other amazing people are doing, sometimes it can route you through to something else. But we've got a very core mission this year to focus on an opportunity we've got coming up at with the United Nations Summit in September that will focus on some big decisions for global education. So every single voice and click and support we get adds to that and helps support that.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
So interesting and really inspiring.
Well, good luck with everything you're doing. Good luck with the podcast, but also with the wider world.
Thank you very much. And same to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Bye. What an incredibly inspiring story.
Can't imagine what it must have been like to experience going from being a private person to suddenly being thrust into the limelight in number 10.
What she's been able to build despite all of that and through all of that and with all of that is really remarkable.
If you're inspired by that, or if you need some inspiration, then head over to the site escapethecity.org and you can subscribe to our newsletter, and we send our top 10 opportunities every week.
All right, Dom, what interesting and inspiring jobs are in the top 10 this week?
We've got a great opportunity. It's for a chief operating officer in Kampala for a transport social enterprise doing really good work out in Kenya. So if you are into a generalistic role, want to move to Kenya, then that's an awesome role.
I might be checking that out, and maybe someone listening would want to do the same.
Cool. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you next week.
Next week on the podcast.
I think because of my experience around the sexual trauma, I really opened up a space to share about sex. So I'd be like, what's going on with sex? What's happening around that?
Billy Quinlan, the co-founder and CEO of sexual wellness startup Furley.
It was the first time these women had ever been asked that question and given a platform and a space to talk about it.